Okay, so hello, welcome to second day of the WebPerf working group TPAC meeting, which is like face-to-face this year. As always, the call is being recorded and will be posted online. And since we have a packed schedule, we're going to talk about pre-rendering first with Jeremy and David leading the way. So Jeremy, do you want to present?
Sure. Let me just. Is that working? Other way.
Yeah.
So, hi, I'm Jeremy from Google. So we're looking at bringing back pre-rendering, and we think that we can do a better job of pre-rendering than we did last time. And we want to build a version of pre-rendering that looks to where the web is going in a number of ways. So we think that this is going to require some help from authors to integrate with this new form of pre-rendering that would help us deliver faster loading basically to users is the main objective there. So this sort of comes in three parts: behavior changes, an opt-in to those behavior changes, and a trigger mechanism. So behavior changes. So we're talking about like pre-navigation, fetching, and rendering. And so we think that in the future that should have well-specified behavior, and that means, ideally, written down, interoperable, and so on, that integrates with other web spec primitives like permission policy and so on to limit nuisance behavior like permission prompts while pages are being rendered before navigation. And we think that this pre-navigation fetching and rendering in the future should limit cross-site tracking in ways consistent with updated browser privacy models that a number of vendors are moving towards. And so we propose to define a behavior of pre-navigation fetch that's uncredentialed, and the definition of a new loading mode in which a browsing context hosts a pre-navigation document, and its behavior is modified consistent with the goals mentioned earlier. Most notably, we think that sites will not be able to access their unpartitioned storage before navigation. And so this means that they only get access to the storage and the credentials that they have stored on that site when navigation actually occurs, which is consistent with the way that works on link navigation or form submission. Because some of those changes, though, are potentially breaking, they're radical that we can't assume that all content will work unmodified. For instance, if you load a site that's signed in, where the user has signed in, and you load it without credentials, the user signed in state won't be properly reflected, and that breakage would be surprising to users. So a site could be prepared to upgrade on navigation, and it needs to declare that it's ready to do that. If a site is completely static and is the same for all users, this is just simply marking it. Otherwise, authors might need to make some modifications before they can make this declaration. Since an HTTP response header is not easy for all authors deployed, we propose also allowing this declaration to occur in the HTML source itself. Authors that are not sure about some subcomponents or third-party libraries that they're loading can simply defer loading those until navigation occurs, and at least the rest of their application will be able to do some of this fetching and rendering logic before navigation occurs. The idea of the response to an uncredentialed fetch opting into being used even when credentials are ultimately present when navigation occurs has previously been proposed and discussed a little bit as pre-navigate and as allows uncredentialed navigation. This is in a similar sort of vein. And then finally, the final piece of that is on the referring site, it needs to indicate that pre-navigation fetching is going to be safe from unwanted side effects. So in the same origin or same site case, we might be comfortable sending credentials, and so sending a GET request potentially has side effects, and the site needs to indicate up front that that's likely to be safe. before the request is sent, because after the GET request is sent, those side effects may have already happened. This is also giving the UA an indication that the resource is going to be compatible. We do, you can double check with the opt-in, but it's if you want to have some indication this is actually likely to work and that the user is actually likely to go with there. Today we've had in the past the link rel pre-render, which today in Chrome triggers something we call no state prefetch. Previously, it triggered a previous iteration of pre-rendering, and that provides a very strong signal. Implementing UAs typically, like nearly always, respect that for a very small number of URLs. And we think that some sort of a hint from the referring site is necessary. It could take a shape similar to that, or it could be a broader thing to simply enable authors to give the information that we absolutely need, which is safe, compatible, and reasonably likely for a broader set of URLs on the page, enabling the user agent to use its own heuristics to determine what amount of work is useful to do in advance. So that's sort of an overview of some of our thinking in that space.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this is all pretty early. We've been thinking and iterating on it for a while with Google and both in public and internally. We have this portals proposal, which kind of a lot of this comes from, but we realized that this was all a lot more general than portals and could have a variety of mechanisms. So if you check out the links that Jeremy put on his first slide, there we have a GitHub repository. It's very work in progress, but it has an overview of the problem space and kind of the directions of the solutions we're thinking of. So that's a great place to check out if you want more information or want to engage.
And one bit that I find particularly interesting here about the upgrade path is that it seems like something that will encourage cacheable static HTML that can upgrade itself into a credentialed user experience compared to the current state of things where the HTML is often dynamic and generated on the fly. And I'm wondering if this is something both authors in the room and CDNs in the room. I'm curious about your thoughts on this and how this can potentially impact the ecosystem.
So since nobody's saying anything, I'll say that maybe it's not that big of a change to the ecosystem. Most sites already have a logged out view. So I guess it depends on whether they lock their entire content behind a login wall or not. Like Facebook, for example, would be very different than GitHub. But for GitHub, this would be very easy. They just display their logged out view. They'd have a little bit of client-side JS to swap out some of the elements to display more like the logged in view. I guess, yeah, for something like Facebook, it would be very different. That's interesting.
Do you folks have examples? What does this upgrade flow actually look like?
There's some sort of quickly written sample code snippets, but we're early days. We don't have examples of adapting real applications in that way, if that's what you mean. The exact shape that API takes depends a little bit on how the API that we develop here evolves, and also how some adjacent APIs like storage access evolve. Because ultimately the thing that authors want to be able to do here is say when storage is available, then load any of this this data that is dependent on the user's personalized state. For applications where the entire application is personalized, there might not be a lot that you can load in advance. But for applications where most of it's static, you can anticipate that visiting your Wikipedia or whatever, most of the content is going to be the same either way. And so a smaller number of components can just say, okay, if I gained access to credential storage and that I discovered in there something that should meaningfully affect the way the page appears, then make those changes. So I'm not sure if I really answered your question, though.
Yeah, you did. I was thinking that there'd probably be some event fired, but would it be a sort of pre-render to render state event change, or is it going to be like you said on storage availability, and is that like broadly applicable to other cases? I guess there's flexibility in terms of where it will go, but that makes sense.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to figure this out. Like there do seem to be APIs for all the individual changes. Like there is a permissions API that will tell you like, oh, you're going to be auto denied while pre-rendered, but now you're in a state where you can ask and it might not be denied. There's a storage access API in at least many browsers that tells you, no, you don't have storage access, and then one day it says, oh yeah, you do. Do we just tell people to like use all these signals individually, or do we expose the like pre-rendering thing as a first class? And even if we do, should we encourage people to use it? Early days. Yeah.
I have a question. So you're going to require that a site declare, I know how to upgrade. And if a site does not declare, I know how to upgrade, and we fetch that content, do we then just throw that fetch away?
I think that if the user has locally stored credentials and the site doesn't declare that it knows how to upgrade, then we can't meaningfully use that response.
Okay.
Because the response that the user would expect would be different.
But if the user does not have locally stored credentials, then we could use that?
I haven't thought through all the details, but my inclination, maybe other people in the room have thoughts, would be that we probably could use that response in some way. I don't think we'd have to refetch it if we fetched it, there were no credentials, and the cache, nothing about like the cache control or anything prevents us from reusing it. I don't see why we couldn't.
But
Okay.
it still might not be good to like reuse the rendering because it was rendered with like IndexedDB throwing, or all the storage access APIs cut off, and so maybe it just like is showing an error screen.
There's some thinking about whether we can do a form of pre-rendering with that's more focused on either preserving existing behavior or canceling the pre-rendering, and in some cases we might be able to use the rendering. In general, we might not be able to use the rendering, but I think we could probably always use, or usually use, the response body, at least for new rendering.
Okay. And if a website has no difference between credentialed and non-credentialed, and it doesn't use any storage at all, then they would still have to say, I know how to upgrade, and my upgrading is doing nothing, right?
I think so. I don't see a way that the user agent can determine that that's the case without the site telling us in general.
Okay.
It would be great if we could, right? It would be great if we can detect that this site is static and the server wouldn't have given us a different response if we'd sent different request headers. But I'm not sure how we can determine that from the client side.
Yeah. Okay.
Are there I mean, you were talking about reusing the render. One of the reasons the original pre-render was killed was because of resource usage, high resources usage by rendering, and so we went to the stateless prefetch or whatever. Did something happen to address that, or are we less concerned about the resources?
I'm not sure if Kineko, did you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, we of course care about the resources, but we started to have a better infrastructure to be able to, for example, like a float or like a freeze at some stage, and also like have a better isolation mechanism between pages. So we feel that we can probably do better, trying to keep watching resource consumption and do better judgment, while we are of course still like exploring the space. But that's the general answer. Jimmy, you probably want to add more.
Yeah, and naturally on user agents that are running on devices where they don't believe that they have enough resources for that to be the most productive use of the user's resources, they should feel free to just prefetch or to do nothing if they think that this is going to net degrade user experience. Like the user agent should decide based on the environment on the user's device, based on the likelihood that the pre-rendering is going to be used by the user, and should make a call about what that is. We hope that pages being able to identify pre-rendering will be able to modify their behavior in such a way that they use fewer resources while pre-rendering. It's up to them. We're interested in pages loading quickly, and part of that is loading using resources that are appropriate for the situation.
But that was the case before, wasn't it? Because the pre-render would send a header saying this is a pre-render, and then you'd get the state change notification that you are coming out of a pre-rendered and into a visible state. So, I mean, the work on a site side isn't necessarily different than it was the first time around. Was there adoption last time or was it? Because if I remember right, there wasn't a whole lot of adoption around people actually coding around it to handle that transition.
Yeah, I think we cannot depend on sites coding around it. I think it's a nice thing that they could do if they wanted to be nicer to the user. But I think, at least from my impression, having joined the summit recently, the shift in thinking really came on the Chrome side when we implemented BF cache, right? Other browsers have had this for a long time, and we had like background tabs, and then we were like, well, background tabs we decide is like a good use of the user's resource. Sometimes why not like things in the past or in the BF cache? And this is just kind of extending the same principle. Like sometimes you can keep things around that aren't immediately visible to the user, and it might improve user experience later. So
I will say on the Chrome side that we've been putting some additional attention toward encouraging authors to improve the performance of their sites with efforts like Core Web Vitals. And so I think I think that you'd hope that authors would do it. I agree that you can't depend on authors doing it. Certainly, also sites and user agents could choose to trigger pre-rendering in cases where they know that the destination site has made those changes. But I agree that that's something that could have happened in the past, and so can't be relied on to happen.
Yeah, I don't want to discourage the work, because we saw the first time it launched, the performance impact when it works can be awesome. It's just I'm historically skeptical about the amount of adoption. Like if it mostly works for lightweight sites that don't have much user authentication, those are the least likely to implement a client-side SPA transition, if you would. And the heavier sites that are doing like SSR and things like that tend to want to have as much state as possible to send down the rendered version of the logged in credentials and not do a full client-side app, if you would, which is what the rehydration almost is when you suddenly get the credentials. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I think it's just going to be challenging.
So Jeremy, you mentioned vitals. Have you thought through implications towards performance measurement?
We have started to think about it. We're having discussions internally about it. There's some complexity to that problem. I don't know that I have conclusions that I can articulate well enough to share it meaningfully right now. Dominic?
Yeah, I think the main thing I realized, we literally were discussing this yesterday, is that pages do want to know if they pre-rendered slowly, right? So we still need to give them all the information that we're giving them now. But in terms of like, they also want to know if they've made the user experience super fast, right? So you should get like two statistics for load time. You should get like the traditional load time, which includes all the time you spent loading in the background, and you should get what the user actually experienced, which could be 0 or very close to 0. So don't know how that's going to manifest in the APIs and in Core Web Vitals and all that, but I feel like those are the two pieces of information you do need to get out.
Yeah, I could not agree more, and we'll be talking about a bunch of related issues upcoming today. So
maybe that ties in a bit to the visibility discussion that David was planning to talk about. But maybe before that, just one question to regarding like to other browser vendors regarding the non-credentialed aspects of pre-rendering. I know that in the past for prefetch, we had a bunch of discussions about ways to make privacy pre-rendering prefetch work, and this is in a way an extension of that. Any quick thoughts on the aspects of non-credentialed pre-render coupled with lack of access to local storage? Would that be something that, from your perspective, is implementable? So mostly talking to Alex and Benjamin.
Implementable, yes, but it's certainly a little strange. My initial thought would have been to just do the load with the credentials and storage in its own partition.
So the partitioned versus no storage is an interesting question. We're not settled, but our reasoning for no storage is that you do eventually need to transition to the first party partition, right? Like when you activate, and so then you have this weird merging problem, right? Like they've written some stuff into IndexedDB in the partition, but now you need to transition them to the main partition. How do you merge those two IndexedDBs? Seems super hard.
I think there may be a fundamental difference in how we're thinking about partitioning, because in our implementation, if you load, if you're on A.com and you prefetch or pre-render B.com, kind of in B.com's partition, then there would be no problem if B.com becomes the main frame's content, because then we just continue along where we started, which is in B.com's partition for B.com's content. And then A.com's content will be in A.com's partition, and we just let it go. And
right, but like if you like load B.com in a partition that's not the partition that stores the user's current pre-existing cookies and credentials and whatnot, then when the user navigates to that, if you don't ever execute a transition, the user observes a state that's not the state that doesn't contain those credentials, and then the user doesn't see themselves as logged in. So they're like, I clicked a link to B.com, I'm logged in on B.com, why am I not logged in?
Yes, I believe the difference in viewpoint here is also a difference in our cookie partitioning between Chromium and WebKit. In WebKit, I see no problem, and I see no need for any web page to opt in to this.
I don't know if this is really like a difference. I think in policy and partitioning, like I think this is a new technology, right? Like going from a embedded context, like there's no way you can take an iframe and say, okay, become the top page, right? So that's the new ingredient here, which, as Jeremy says, creates a very unexpected user experience if you're partitioned. Like you could literally have two tabs next to each other for the same website, one of which you're logged in and one you're not, and you could just be like, why am I not logged in?
But if you're pre-rendering something that you're thinking you might navigate to, then the current page has no access to its content, and it won't display it until you actually do the navigation, right?
Right.
So Yeah, I don't know. I don't know where the difference is, but there's a difference, and
So
Yeah,
we
okay,
wrote up our threat model. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. What you're describing seems to me to be inconsistent with my understanding of WebKit's ITP policies. But it's possible I don't understand them well enough.
okay. It's also possible I don't understand them well enough. So.
Maybe the difference comes from the fact that what Dominic and Jeremy and others have been looking at is a model that works both for pre-rendering and portals, where
I don't think so. I think this problem arises just with pre-rendering. Because I think like if you load it and you allow it to execute, you will, even if you just do the fetch with credentials, like if you do the fetch with credentials triggered by a.com to b.com, then this basically allows you to do the equivalent of sending a sub-resource request with credentials, which if you start partitioning storage, like is the exact thing that storage partitioning prevents. Which is, you know, if you're in a world where you believe that third-party subframes and sub-resources should be partitioned, should be partitioned, should not be part of the first-party partition for that sub-origin. Then you have to do the same thing for pre-rendering requests, or you can use pre-rendering requests to do to execute whatever sort of threat you were trying to prevent by partitioning.
I'd love to work through this offline though. Like I think this is, I'm pretty sure we're aligned, but it'd be great to work through it. I guess to be clear, like we're designing this much more to match Safari's model than to match Chrome's current model, is why I feel that way.
Okay, and so maybe the action item would be to like either further discuss it in an upcoming working group call or offline on GitHub and try to figure out the source of difference.
Can I ask one question? Can you hear me?
Yep.
So when you say uncredentialed, so like when a pre-render happens, are you saying that there's no cookies and anything like that available to the site?
Yes, that's what we're proposing.
Okay.
At least in the cross-origin case.
So
at least in the cross-origin case.
Right. Yeah. So whenever you do the cross origin, you do the pre-render in a completely like brand new state each time, and then that's why that allows credential navigations or whatever comes into play. Yeah, I have to think about if there's some sort of timing attack possible here.
There are timing attacks possible, which is part of why we're trying to cut off credentials, right? So. If you have no access to your storage, then you can't say like, oh, it's user X, and then use a timing correlation to like communicate that for cross-site tracking. That's our thinking. But I'm sure there are. This is a subtle and complicated area, so I do also encourage you to find other attacks that we haven't thought of. Sorry to.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I can't reason through it in my head right now. Too early in the morning, but yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll look into that. Right, thanks.
Cool. And with that, maybe David can talk a bit about the visibility aspects, because I think a lot of this work is happening in areas that this working group decided that will move more towards HTML. So this is, in a way, continuation of resource hints that we decided to split up and integrate into HTML directly. But the visibility aspects of pre-rendering are things that we'll still need to take into account with page visibility. So David, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. Can you see my slide okay?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, this I think ties pretty well into what this group has been doing. So I know there used to be a pre-render value for visibility state in the spec, but this was removed since it's no longer implemented anywhere. I couldn't really find any context, so I'd be happy to hear what maybe experiences were like from back then, or if we thought that was a mistake or not. But as far as I could tell, this was mostly just a lack of implementation at the time. So as Jeremy mentioned, like now that we have these pre-rendering browsing contexts coming back, we need some way to signal to a page that it's being pre-rendered. The obvious question has often been like, is visibility hidden enough? It seems like when you're pre-rendered, you can't actually see the page. So what's really different there? And I think that there are some differences. They're not necessarily very mainstream cases, but for things like analytics or ads, you really do want to know the difference between just being in a background tab and being pre-rendered. There are also some other edge cases. So portals, which I'll talk about in a second, they act like a pre-render, but they might be visible to the user. So you can't just do something like avoid loading visible resources and things like that. So this is very early, and I don't think that we have any like solid concrete proposals yet, but these are just things that I'm looking into and kind of trying to piece together what would be a good thing to do. I mean, is pre-render as a visibility state even web compatible, or if we would rather have that be a separate bit, that's like something I'm interested in. Document.hidden is another, it's like an on-off flag, so it is kind of confusing in this state. So on compatibility, I've been looking at what existing pages do here. So because of the legacy, there is a lot of existing usages where they actually look at pre-rendering state. So this would be nice since a lot of things like ads and analytics are already looking at it. It would just work out of the box. On the other hand, there are also cases where they check, like if visible, do something, otherwise just assume that we're not visible. So it's not necessarily clear what the break-even point there is. But since the pre-rendering that we're proposing right now would require an opt-in, I don't think that it's super critical that it be 100% compatible. We're just mostly looking at what would be the easiest path for web developers. And then also, like, does this make sense on visibility state? I'm curious what other people's thoughts are here. Again, like what does it mean for document.hidden? And like visibility might not necessarily describe this well enough, since in some cases we can't actually say for sure whether or not you're visible or not, like in a portal. So for folks who don't know, portals is like a super early proposal for effectively a window into a pre-rendering. You can think of it as like a preview. And basically the difference here from pre-rendering is that you might actually be visible to the user. So whereas previously, if you're pre-rendering, you can assume that the user can't see you. That's not necessarily the case for a portal. The other major difference, at least currently our thinking, is that a portal might, a page might be able to be put back into a portal, which is also something that's very different from pre-rendering of old, where you assume that you start off pre-rendering and then you become visible. Here we can actually go from visible to being in a portal. So I'm not sure if necessarily pre-rendering as a state here makes sense. But yeah, that's kind of like a whirlwind of questions rather than actual answers or anything, but I'm curious what others think of this.
Hey, this portal idea might get us out of some of the current jams we have with visibility and app launchers. So that idea sounds really intriguing to me. I would like to learn more about it.
Sure. So go ahead.
I'll just say we have a pretty in-depth explainer on portals, and we are currently in the process of rebasing it on top of the pre-rendering explainers. As I said, like we started with portals, and then we realized that this was all much more general. So keep that transitional state in mind. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, a portal kind of looks and feels like an iframe. That it starts off as like an embedded or an embedding on a page, but really it's completely isolated from the page, and it's maybe more like a link, basically, where you can just see the preview of the navigation. I'm curious what the similarity here, or what the issue is with this app launchers use case you mentioned.
Oh, we've had some discussions over the last month about is the browser is the state visible or hidden from that app launcher perspective when you're no longer in the browser per se, but you are seeing things that have been rendered in a browser. So from the glance, one coffee in on a Tuesday, it feels like that problem at least has a framework for being explained in what you're talking about, which is encouraging.
Benjamin, I was going to mention the same thing. I think you mean app switcher, like the OS level app switcher. Okay, yeah, because there are app launchers that might be relevant because it's the initial load or something like that. So I can imagine having like a type of app launcher interface that also uses portals. But the case we were talking about specific to visibility is if you launch the OS level app switcher on mobile, there are cases where the tab contents act kind of hidden, but also kind of visible. And so it could be a tertiary state. And so if we're going to rip off the Band-Aid of moving from a Boolean, all of a sudden a bunch of opportunities arise. And so we weren't really sure how to handle this.
Yeah.
So the similarities there with the state of portals is that the content is viewable, but is not fully, like it's not the top level document. So it's if we had some sort of a preview state, it would probably fit with both.
Yeah, I think the key distinction here is it's not really interactive. I think same thing in the app switcher as in a portal. You can't interact with the content. You're basically just seeing a preview. So that's actually, yeah, that seems like a very similar use case to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, non-interactive was the proposed. I think Ryosuke proposed that at some point, was the proposed state.
Yeah.
But for Compat, I think the idea of having a new visibility state portal that we can define a little bit more clearly, I think that will probably be a smoother path forward.
To be clear, was this in the document.visibility state?
It's a page visibility. So not document.visibility, but the page visibility API, which is a separate thing. Let me find a link.
So I have one question though. Isn't the visibility state determined on the page level right now? So like, say if you have an iframe that's not within the viewport, it can still be considered visible. So how is portal different in that case?
Yeah, so
go ahead.
It's really weird to think of like portals. People's intuition often think of portals as iframes, but they share very little with them. I think it's better to think of them as like pop-up windows that just happen to be overlaid on the page. So they should have a completely separate visibility state from their embedder document.
Yeah. One thing here where it seems like we have multiple states that have some overlap, like the Venn diagram is a bit weird because we could have, so for pre-render, we could have hidden content, but we also need to know that it's pre-rendered in order to not do various things. In a way, it's both hidden and non-interactive, where you could think of one as a subset of the other, but here we need, we need to have some way to mix and match those. So I wonder if the best path would be 3 or 4 states that have some overlap between them, or multiple orthogonal signals that we can mix together. But yeah, it requires some more thinking, at least on my part.
Yoav, that came to mind as well, like as a straw man, specifically because we discussed this at the working group meeting, but so many sites check for not visible as a hint for hidden, or not hidden as a hint for visible. And sometimes you explicitly mean all states, not including this one, and sometimes you mean just the other state. And so it's hard to tell. And maybe one way to get out of that bind is it enough to think of visible and hidden in all of these cases, especially since Portals has both the hidden and the visible, or rather pre-render has both the visible case in Portals and the hidden case in just pre-render. So should there be like a visibility type as to where it's being displayed? And so, the app switcher would be an example of visible, but a different type of embedding, and so on. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like there's going to be you could imagine a bunch of different Boolean switches, right? Like app switcher, no. Portal, no. Pre-render, no. Background tab, no. We could make a matrix of all those and look at all the 2 to the n states and see how many of them actually occur in practice. And that could guide us towards whether we want a series of orthogonal Booleans or a big enum or.
And then the other aspect, right, is in addition to what would be the ideal thing to design in the abstract is what can we reasonably get to from here with the minimal changes to existing content.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is what would you consider the visibility state for a portal on a page in that case? Because if it's visible, you want it to be visible in the sense of it's drawing content and you want it to be ready. But if you have a portal in a background tab somewhere, you don't want that to be doing lots of work and sucking up resources. But we also don't want to have it be tied to the top page's visibility, because that's also a timing communication channel. So having a preview value was appealing from the fact that we could just say, if you're in a portal, you're preview or a pre-render or whatever, and we just never change that and just make sure that you do the right thing for being in a portal or a pre-render.
Why is that a timing communication channel?
So if you switch tabs and both pages get the page visibility change at the same time, then they can correlate that that's the same user.
Yeah.
But you could do this as well with an iframe already.
Yeah, portals are meant to be much more locked down than iframes.
In particular, iframes will get their storage partitioned, whereas portals will eventually not get their storage partitioned, right, when you activate them.
Yeah.
Okay, then this does make it much harder to reason what's the visibility state of a portal.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So some of it sort of comes down to what is the actual concept that visibility state
you would
is.
want it to have animations and whatnot, and in the portal hidden state, you would want it to block animations. So
yeah, so I mean, there's like two general use cases. It's like one is know whether you want to execute some amount of work, but then there's the other use case, which is tracking performance, in particular of paint metrics. So I think just keeping those in mind, I think we want to try to satisfy both of them, I mean, whatever state we decide to give to the portal. Presumably, like ideally, we'd want the portal to count as having paint metrics when it's still a portal, but if we can't say that it's backgrounded when the page is backgrounded, then it's kind of hard, right?
I mean, I think to some extent it might be better to think of it as always backgrounded, right? Like it's okay if your preview doesn't have animations. You know, this is really just like an extra preview on top of pre-rendering, and you would never tell the pre-rendered page like you're visible.
So that pre-rendered page never changes? Or if it does change, how does it change?
Sorry, I don't quite understand.
So you have this static pre-render, and if it's of like a page A, and what happens after it's pre-rendered, page A changes. Is that pre-render also updated?
You mean the page is navigated?
Like a portal can animate, right? Like contents within a portal.
We don't like take we don't envision taking like a single screenshot and freezing that for all time. So if you make changes to your page, like I think we would allow the document lifecycle to run, allow paint to happen, allow a frame to be generated. A user agent, you could imagine choosing to do that at a lower rate or something if it thought that was the right thing to do. But like because like the first frame you get might not be the final frame, right? You do want to like show the page completing loading as it completes loading.
But that conflicts with the goal of basically treating it as hidden always, where some pages are explicitly written to not animate or not show video or not background play or whatever it is when hidden.
Yeah, well, I mean, so things you probably don't want, background play or like the video going or whatever when it's like tiny, you can't really see it. But you don't want the page to like not show up at all.
Right.
I would imagine that most pages probably don't like block like DOM attachment and like style on like page visibility, but it's sort of a question of what exactly do people use page visibility for.
And to be clear, you do have to opt in. So this is all like you will have done a cursory audit at least to say like when I'm portaled, do I behave reasonably? And if you have blocked all of your DOM rendering behind is not visible, then your audit will say, oh, oops, I need to fix that first.
Yeah, but one conflicting requirement with what we talked earlier about, like the preview state, is that for the tab switcher case and the app switcher case, we do want animations and video and everything to continue to play. That is something that web pages currently do, and browsers support them. So,
but we don't know how that fits in with HTML ideas of a page. So,
yeah,
any work there I would be really interested in specifically.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I mean, we've been thinking of these pre-rendering things on the HTML spec level as browsing contexts. So I guess I think app switcher things are probably still browsing contexts, right? If they can display animations and stuff, at least in some level. I think, but then there is a question, Yoav says maybe there's a conflict where largely because of the privacy reasons, we just don't want the portals to know if they're to be doing animations and stuff. So maybe app switchers and portals can't be unified in exactly that way. Maybe they can, like, this is all just, what we've been talking about for 15 minutes. We haven't, but that's my initial impression.
Yeah, but your concept of taking a large whiteboard and doing a table with all the different states and seeing where everything fits sounds like the right next step to figure out what here can be coalesced versus be provided as an orthogonal signal.
Since folks are quiet, on the previous topic of pre-render, you asked for feedback from Apple and Mozilla. I don't know if Benjamin had a chance. I don't know if you had anything to say. I was curious.
I don't really have anything to say, but I was curious to see, like, I guess my initial impression of that discussion was, can you start this work with pre-rendering on the most simple, like, it's okay for me if you restrict the domain to something that you feel is insignificant, like even just static sites, just to see kind of the mechanism, how it works and how it's clear. I feel like that would probably be helpful for me. The local storage thing is like, I don't know how you're going to get around that. So that's why I thought, like, start with something really simple would be my advice. Yeah.
Also, Ryosuke and I chatted a little bit offline, and I see the wisdom in not allowing local storage or credentials. That can be problematic.
Cool.
Do you know if the previous work in this area, do you know what types of sites got the most benefit? Like, is there any granularity there?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not sure if any of the other Google folks who were around at the time know off the top of their head.
Sorry, what are you asking about when it was beneficial in a previous attempt? Was that right? I think, yeah, previously we didn't have like a stronger opt-in model or like any limitations. So if it hit, it was basically very fast. So that like hitting or not was more important. And also like how it impacts like a resource usage on the current page was also kind of like impacted. But basically it was, yeah, if it hits or not was the most important part.
Yeah, I think the question was more like which sites tended to pre-render well and which sites tended to not. Is that?
Right. It's more about like what type of web content is best suited for. Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So I might not have a good answer. I know that the few pages had issues, but they like fixed it. They needed to fix it. But yeah, otherwise, I don't know if there were like a significant difference between sites or not. We don't have data for that. Or like I don't have data right away. Sorry.
Yeah, I also think that there are fundamentally different issues between credentialed content pre-rendering and non-credentialed content pre-rendering, and the issues here would be, of the type of a GET request that logs off the user or whatnot, where for non-credentialed pre-rendering, you would have issues of content that the user expected to be pre-rendered, to be credentialed, but then it ended up not being credentialed, and the site, opted into saying that it should work with that some sort of an upgrade mode, but haven't done the work to actually do that. So I think that the issues would be fundamentally different between credentialed and non-credentialed, basically. on the front, so just random. So are other browsers doing some sort of pre-rendering today, or is that a thing of the past, or not of the past, but because is Safari doing pre-rendering? Because I think it used to do that, like URL bar sort of pre-rendering at some point. And
that we still do, but that's a very different thing, right? Because when the user's typing the URL, like there's no like a tracking per se, you know.
Yeah, so it's not content driven, it's browser driven. And in those cases, I'm guessing you're pre-rendering the full site with credentials and all?
I believe so, yeah.
So
Okay.
we have some questions about this. We've been just wondering, like, what if the user types a URL that's like example.com/logout and you pre-render that with credentials?
There are probably some small issues in edge cases like that.
Okay. The other thing we noticed, I think this got fixed, but like if you type some things in the URL bar, your computer will start speaking to you because the speech synthesis API was not disabled while pre-rendering. One of the things we're hoping to do with this effort is produce a specification for these pre-rendering browsing contexts, which is really exhaustive and says like, okay, shut down all these APIs. And that could be useful even for browser-initiated pre-rendering. You know, not really part of the web platform, so it's certainly not mandatory they would use it, but hopefully it's something that browsers would find useful and maybe reuse the same internal architecture.
Well, so in the case where the user is typing the URL, I don't think we want to do the stateless thing because it's not necessary, right? So like, I think the API surface there needs to be necessary, sort of different.
But the other,
totally agreed. There's these pre-rendering browsing contexts, as we've currently written them up, come in two variants. There's the same origin version and the cross-origin version. And the cross-origin version does all the privacy protection credentials stuff. But the same origin version does all the user annoyance prevention, which might be useful even for the browser-initiated case.
Because it'd be great to be interoperable about things like what alert does, what the permissions API does, whether audio can autoplay, whatever else.
Also, probably the visibility discussion could be applicable to the cases.
Right, yeah. So I mean, it's probably still useful. Although, to be fair, I don't know. Don't all browsers now disallow autoplayable audio in the first place, right? So that problem, you know, is not really there. But I mean, I'm sure there are some edge cases where something, you know, I'm sure there's some APIs that may need to behave differently. So it's probably worth exploring that space.
Yeah, obviously anything that's behind a user gesture, a pre-rendered page can't receive a user gesture. But I think there still are probably some lingering APIs that don't require user gesture, but which nonetheless shouldn't happen.
Cool. So with that, we're at time for this discussion. Any last points someone wants to raise or critical questions? Because if not, I think we can go on a 5-minute break instead of yesterday's 10-minute break. I chose to split the break into 2 5-minute breaks that seem more useful to this format. But let's reconvene in 5 minutes to talk about SPA reporting.